Hello, and before we start today's video, I just wanted to highlight something here in the background in the old history of NAS. You might be coming to this video because this is the first system you've ever been looking at jumping away from the cloud onto your own private NAS. Maybe you are one of the people that have made your way away from the brand Drobo, who are quite a big name in photo and video editing ever since they chapter 11'd it down at bankruptcy there, and you've been looking at Synology as an alternative due to a lot of reputation in the Mac community and content creators, regardless of why you were looking at this system. I'll be straight with you. One of the things you might be looking at this for is because it's an 8-bay desktop NAS system with 10 GBE, and you might be thinking, well, it sounds fair enough. Well, let me just tell you something. Let me school you for just a moment. This is a system that long-time Synology fans have been waiting for the better part of a decade. Synology have got a lot of different kinds of hardware. They've got a lot of different kinds of desktop, a lot of different kinds of rack mount. But when it comes to an 8-bay, 10 GBE system with an half-decent CPU, seriously, this is it. The only one that's ever come before it was a NAS back in 2017 called the DS1823. 8 bays, it was 10 GBE, and had a CPU only slightly more powerful than a Casio calculator. So this is a big deal, and I know it's pricey, and I know it looks the same as the other NAS that came out about a year ago, 1821 Plus, but take my word for it, this is a big deal. And in today's review we're going to be looking at this system. Of course we're going to look at the software later on, but predominantly it's going to be about, does this system live up to the reputation that it should have, the waiting time people have had for a system of this caliber, because frankly 10 GB on an 8-bay is not new, it's not groundbreaking, but I will say that in this format with their software in this way, this has a lot to live up to. What a long, angry introduction that was. Yes, that's right. This is the DS1823xs Plus from Synology NAS. I didn't even know about until about a month ago. And I normally have quite finger on the pulse about these things. But this system here is borrowing a lot of high demand aspects in its architecture from different areas of the portfolio in one solution. It's going to do all the stuff you expect in DSM-7. And again, more on that later on in the video when we go through the software. But this architecture on 10 GBE is trying to find a middle ground for all of the different business users and indeed those in post-production and content creation that are looking for a compact but powerful NAS system. And because it's in the XS series, that means it is enterprise. However, I can think of a lot of prosumer users that are going to look at this because of its architecture and that hardware. Now, normally in these reviews, I would start with an unboxing. I would also start and talk about its predecessor. But two things. One, the box is pretty big. And if you go to the article in the description over at NAS Compares, I've taken a lot of images. It's very well packed, exceedingly well protected, well presented. It's got huge amounts of protection inside. It is exceedingly well protected in there, and we've got the accessories to go through. Next up, why am I not talking much about its predecessor? Well, as the introduction would suggest, it doesn't have one. This system sort of is the follow-up to the NAS up here, the DS1621xs, a 6-bay system that had 10 GBE on board. It was a 6-bay, so again, it wasn't quite enough storage for people that wanted to muck around with like a RAID 6. So a lot of people go to an 8-bay extending a RAID 6, couple of drives, maybe even a hot spare for you guys that are worried about an extra bit of failover and, you know, turnaround on getting back to normal. An 8-bay has always had that desirable factor. Now, there has been a lot of 8-bays in Synology's history, and again, generally arriving every 2 to 3 years, but this is the first one, with the exception of that 1879 I mentioned earlier on, that again was basically a mouse CPU. This device here has got a lot set on it. Now, it arrives with quite a substantial price tag. Let's be honest, it's going to knock around, again, depending where you are, your local tax, your currency and stuff, about 17 to 1800 nicker, depending on where you are. So that's not a small sum of money. Now, a lot of that comes down to the fact that it's in the XS series. What that means, as mentioned, it isn't just that it's enterprise, it means that the hardware architecture is designed to last. Also, on top of that, it's going to get even longer term firmware and software updates, not just your standard security, but real time invested in innovations and upgrades within DSM on this platform moving forward, and it has 5 years of hardware manufacturer's warranty and support. So unlike the majority of their portfolio that has either 2 or 3 years, that's a huge step up, and that's kind of some of the main ways in which that price point, other than obviously the hardware architecture, where your money is actually going. Now, in terms of accessories, you get the system itself that you can see there in its metal chassis, but we'll talk about design later on. But the accessories you get with the device, you've got information on your local kind of Synology outlet there. On top of that, you've got information on the installation guide there. There's also details on that 5-year warranty in there as well. 2 Cat5e cables. Very small complaint. I'm glad that there's 2 cables in there. This does have a combination 10 and 1 gigabit Ethernet port there, all of which are copper. But if you've got a 10G port, I'd expect minimum Cat6, frankly. And I know it's a short distance. I know it's a small quibble, but then including a Cat6 cable would not have been too bad either. Cat6, particularly on distance, is better for 10 GBE. You've got screws for 2.5-inch media there. When it comes to 3.5-inch, as you'll see later on, you don't need to worry too much about the installation because it's click and load on those trays. Keys to lock those individual drives. And again, these trays, as we've mentioned in other videos, these aren't like sturdy locks. Anyone with a half decent bit of leverage is going to get that drive out of there. The idea is to inhibit accidental removal, as well as just basically when it's in transit or moving around, and just ultimately just the sense of rigidity to not only the RAID inside but the system itself. This isn't major theft proof, but still nonetheless it's nice to have it in there, and they're quite well designed trays as well. And you've got your UK mains lead there, but I will say that this is an internal PSU device, 250 watt internal power supply. So again, if ever you hit a PSU issue, obviously if you're in the warranty, you can just send the device off to Synology, easy as. But when it comes to replacing it yourself, you are going to have to sort of get your hands a bit dirty. But apart from that, that's all of your accessories. A fairly standard amount there. What I would say is missing from this, something I've mentioned in other videos and also will come up later on in the video, I don't like that there isn't heat sinks for the internal M2 NVMe slots. And again, we will go into more detail on that later on, but it's very, it's growing quite a lot now for a lot of NAS brands to include just small little heat sinks like that one. They're adhesive based, and you can take these little adhesive blocks, attach them to M2 NVMe's that you can install inside the 2 slots inside there, and therefore when they're under heavy use, the heat being generated by the controller, because the NAND, that's okay to get a bit warm, it works better, that's where your data is, but the controller, effectively the CPU of these devices, this, when you're not throwing it around the room, needs to dissipate that heat, hence why you would attach a heat sink there to help that disperse into the air. And this system doesn't arrive with any of these. And again, these are not expensive. You can buy these online for cents, you know. So I'm kind of surprised that Synology haven't included heat sinks for those M2s for another reason that will become apparent later on. But apart from that, in terms of the accessory list, you know, the lack of a Cat6, the lack of those heatsinks, not much else really to complain about. And the presentation of it and the structural integrity of the shipping box that it's in is very, very good. But ultimately, we talked enough about, you know, what you get with it and, you know, when it gets shipped to you. Let's talk a little bit about the design of the DS1823xs Plus. Now this is a very familiar chassis to anyone that's been using Synology for a long time. The 8-bay series from Synology, with the exception of a few minor tweaks, has always arrived in this form. You have 8 SATA connected bays there on the front, and with those individual bays there you can install 2.5-inch and 3.5-inch media very easily. Now, open that bay up there, open that up, you can see inside we've got a Synology drive there. Now, for those of you that aren't aware, Synology have their own range of hard drives. Again, the majority of their systems can use third-party drives as well, from WD, Seagate, Toshiba or whatever, but Synology have rolled out their own HAT5300 Enterprise hard drives, which are Toshiba drives with their own firmware and badging on top. Also recently, we talked about the reveal of the HAT3300 standard class series of NAS drives, which are Seagate Iron Wolf drives with Synology firmware there on board. More on that, I believe, when there'll be an official reveal on that one from from Synology. And of course, there are their own SSDs as well, the SAT5200, their own M2 NVMe's, the SMB3400 and 3410 there. So we've got a big old range of hard drives and SSDs. But why am I making such a song and dance talking about it? Well, because again, if you're very familiar with Synology, you'll know that their XS series and above, at least in the last couple of generations, since about 2021, 2022 crossover, the compatibility lists have become a wee bit more refined. That's a polite way to put it, isn't it? Refined. If you head to their website and you look at which hard drives are, compatible with these devices, WD is on there like 1 or 2 different Ultrastar drives. There's no Seagate on there, at least at the time of recording. And what you do find on there is all Synology media, because Synology say if you're going to go for one of their XS series boxes, they have tested and can verify all of the performance measurements and everything it can do with their own media, which a lot of people are not overly keen on. And if you do install drives that are not on that compatibility list, what happens is the system will allow you to build a storage port, allow you to build volumes, allow you to do all the things you want to do, but it won't allow you to remove where it says it's unverified. And all the way through the use of the system, it will always tag this drive as an unverified drive. So you are using the system in a configuration that Synology themselves have not, signed off on insofar as the way their system works. Now, it doesn't mean if you're going to contact them for a warranty, they're just going to go, there's the door. They're not going to do that. But they will state that they can't easily recreate your circumstance. They will also highlight that maybe if there is an error or a fault, it has been caused by you using the device in a way that they themselves have not verified for use within their support and compatibility. And that creates a little grey area for some users. Now, again, this only really, at least at desktop level, only affects XS series and above. Everything else, the Plus series, the J series, all of that, they're fine. Huge compatibility listings. But just bear in mind, at least at the time of recording, if you go for this device, the hard drive compatibility and SSD listings there are a little smaller than other ones. I will say their drive media is good. It does perform. We've got 4 of them inside this system. I had originally 2, and I'm going to be migrating the existing storage pool that's inside, which will then allow me to, get some better 10G performance numbers. Whether that's in this video, I'm not sure it will be, because it will take a while to expand into those drives. But another cool thing to bear in mind with this system is that because it's got 8 bays, you don't have to just create one pool. And a lot of users that will look at this system might use 4 drives like that to create one storage pool area, like a RAID 5 or something like that, and then use that for one purpose. But then they might create a separate collection of drives that they then want to use to create a secondary pool, which can then be used for other tasks. So it allows you to create maybe a hot, warm and cold storage area utilizing different storage drives and the M2 NVMe bays inside. More on those in a moment. Now, going back to that compatibility point, if you do want to use the M2 NVMe bays inside, then if we remove the 2 empty bays there in the middle, the thing to bear in mind here is not only that lack of heat dissipation that we mentioned earlier on in an inclusive add-on heatsink, but as you can see there with both those drives inside, and there is enough space, I would argue, for a heatsink there, by the way, before anyone raises that point. But you may notice that those drives are Synology SSDs. Once again, when it comes to compatibility of SSDs inside this system, you've got to use, at least at the time of recording, their own SSDs. Now, the good news is this device does support not just those SSDs being used in caching, they can also be used for raw storage pools. Good news, right? But those M2 NVMe bays, although they're Gen 3 x 4 hardware lane, they've been downgraded to 3.1, at least as far as we could see in PuTTY. But I'll show you that more on the software side of the video later. So, not only are you using their current gen SMV3400s, which are built more, I would argue, for durability than they are for performance, but you're also going to be throttled at 1000 megs with those drives inside, so do bear that in mind. Now, if you're connecting via 10GBE, who cares? It's 1000 megs. But if you're going to upgrade the network interface ports, then that might be a bit of a barrier for you. Now, you've got two of them. You can RAID 0 them up. You'll get about 1500, I reckon, or at least going by Synology's own performance measurements there. 1500 megs per second maybe on read. Write will be lower. These drives have a lower write rate. Again, because they predominantly use for cache there. Synology, when we have spoken to them kind of unofficially and through other contacts, it seems predominantly the reason they've done that is because of heat and degradation on the drives, and they don't want it to automatically throttle internally. But I think there's a lot of users out there that aren't overly keen on those bays kind of knocking those down to 1000 megs somewhat artificially. Now, another thing about the storage to bear in mind, the storage there, it doesn't support Synology Hybrid RAID. Now, this will become a very familiar point to anyone that's followed Synology for a while that is well aware of the fact that Synology XS systems do not have the hybrid RAID system. But for those of you particularly, more than anyone, that are moving from Drobo over here, and that we're moving from a defunct Drobo that's going to be EOL and end of life, end of use, and I'm moving to Synology, you might have heard about a great thing called SHR, Synology Hybrid RAID, which is the ability to mix and match the drives. You can go ahead, put in a case of an 8-bay, put 5 drives in. They can all be different capacities. They can all be the same. And then later on, introduce new, bigger drives, which allows you to absorb the bigger space and expand the RAID very easily. Right? That sounds familiar? Drobo called that Beyond RAID, right? Synology have got SHR, right? Well, they do. Just not on this. This does not support SHR. Now, Synology, we talked about this a couple of years ago with the DS1823xs. Synology, when contacted about why the XS series does not support SHR, they've always made it clear that SHR does not provide the performance that the standard traditional RAIDs like RAID 0, RAID 1, RAID 5, RAID 6 in comparative terms provide. Consequently, because the XS series is geared far more towards throughput, performance, click, 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 give me my data, they removed SHI. It still has BTRFS, which is great, or the ext4 option, but I know a lot of users will be sad to hear, particularly those moving from Drobo that heard great things about SHR, that it's not available on this. Now, if you already own a Synology NAS that has an existing RAID group in SHR, again, maybe a 920 that you're scaling up from a 4 to an 8-bay, or any existing Synology NAS that has an SHR, you'll be pleased to hear that you can migrate that group over and you can still access SHR on this system. You just can't create an SHR storage pool from within this system overall. Now, moving away from storage, and I will put the bays back in eventually, I want to talk about this chassis a little bit, because I've talked about it before. It is one of my favourite Synology chassis by a country mile. Not only because it is incredibly compact for 8 bays of storage, but look at that ventilation there at the back. Not only are the SATA ports all combined data and power, so no loose cables, the fans almost cover the entirety of that. With those fans, remember, going to be blowing air directly over those M2s there on the side. On top of that, fully ventilated on the inside there with lots of holes to allow the air to pass through. And then if that is not enough, with the metal panel acting as heat dissipation, the side panels, the Synology ones, are mesh dust capture kind of logo bays there on the side. It is by far one of my favourite Synology chassis, simply because it gets so much right in terms of storage and still maintains a tremendous amount of storage. When you think that, hard drives these days are arriving in 18, 20, 22 TB, again, at the time of recording, that's a huge amount of data to be playing with there inside this system. And it's just a chassis that I've always liked, because although you might think, who cares, the other ones are just 4-bay, they're plastic chassis, and these moving on to metal, when you've got more heat, more airflow through, you think this thing is going to be insanely noisy. And it isn't. Yes, it's noisy. I'm not going to suggest it's silent. That would be foolish. And yes, a metal chassis and 2 rear fans can generate noise, and we will do a noise test on this video soon. But I will say, comparatively, compared to other NAS systems that are a bit smaller in the 6 and the 4-bay systems, it's not that noisy compared to those. It's only really going to be noisy if you use bigger drives that are larger than about 10 TB, that are then are 7200 RPM. Things like these 16 TBs here, they're going to make a racket, but that's not to do with the system. It's to do with the hard drives themselves having more platters, the ARM having to work a lot harder, and the RPM of those drives moving all the faster. You know, helium sealed drives, lovely news, more platters inside, great stuff, you know, lesser drag. But they're noisy drives, which will be amplified in this system. But even with that in mind, the chassis for me is still one of Synology's best, and had they changed this, I'd have been absolutely livid. But for now, let's get these drives back in here and start talking about those ports and connections. So the majority of connections on this device are going to be a little predictable, not only because we've talked about them a lot already, but because it's largely what we've seen time and time again from Synology in this chassis. So if we look at the back there, I'm sorry if I'm clouding the mic a little bit there. If we look at the bottom there, we can see a whole host of Ethernet connectors there. We've also got that PSU there on the side of the chassis, and the light went a bit weird there, didn't it? That's what I get for covering the light sensor with this. But if we have a look at these ports and connections, let's start going through them. Now, down here, we've got 2 gigabit LAN connections there, so 1 GBE each. You can use those either to let the incoming internet connection here into the system or add it to an existing switch. Next up, we have got the 10 GBE connection here. Now, this is the reason I'm not ragging on this too much. The XS series, at least for the last few years, has always been 10 GBE equipped, and although you can spend about $1,000, maybe 1150 more than this to get the 12 bay version of this with 2 10 GBE ports, more on that later, it's still nice to have that 10G there at this storage level. You know, 8 bays of even fairly bog standard drives will probably more than saturate a single 10GB connection, but don't worry, that's what this over here is for. But again, if you're looking to edit directly on the NAS, and you can direct connect cable to cable a PC or Mac and this and edit directly onto the NAS, do check out my video editing Synology video from a couple of weeks ago. That 10G port also allows you to introduce this NAS to an existing switch, some of those more cost-efficient switches that have got one 10G port and the rest are one, and that allows 1000 megs connection into that network for lots of 1G connected devices to, you know, get full saturation on their respective connections there. Just make sure you've got the right media inside to make the most of it. But as mentioned, you can exceed internally that performance very easily, notwithstanding the 2 M2 NVMe's inside at 1000 megs a pop and the 8 bays of storage that you can use SSDs for. You've got a lot of storage to play with here. So with that in mind, you've also got the PCIe upgrade slot here. Now, good news and a tiny bit of bad, but I'll get onto that in a sec. From this slot, you can install another 10GBE port. You can install a dual port card. You can install a 25 gigabit Ethernet core dual port card. There's loads of ways to really open up the bandwidth on this if the rest of your hardware environment and network hardware environment is ready to take that. But I will add that you can't use, at the moment at least, this. This is Synology's combo card, the E10G20T1. I might have got that name wrong. There's a lot of PCIe cards. This device not only has a 10G port, but it's got 2 M2 NVMe slots on that card. Now, if you put it inside this system, you can use the 10G port, but you can't use the M2s. Now, why is that a pain, given it's already got 2 inside? Well, because those M2s, that's more performance. Even if you were just going to use them for caching, that could really help. And even if you didn't use them for caching and you were able to use them as storage pools, much like the 2 slots inside, that would be a huge amount of performance to play with there that would allow you to use in a combo card to have another 10G port and open up 2000 megs external connection. It doesn't mean you're not going to be able to take advantage of it internally, but although for the most part, I'm really pleased that there is both a 10G and an upgrade without having to make you choose because of the 2 inclusive M2s. It would have been nice to be able to use that card as well and harness both the M2 slots and the 10GBE. Maybe there'll be an upgrade card coming soon in both the M2 only card and that combo card that will allow this feature, but for now it looks like something not really available because this system has those slots inside. But talking long term, the system also has two eSATA ports there. Those two eSATA ports there allow you to add two 5-bay expansion devices to this system. So the 8 bays of storage can have another 10 added in its lifespan. Lovely stuff there. You do have to use Synology's own expansions, the DX517. You can't use another one, and they are JBOD, so the RAID is managed by the system, but you've still got the option there to scale 8 bays of storage up to a potential 18 down the line there. Once again, another reason why enhancing your network performance might be absolutely beautiful. There are USB ports there, but as mentioned in other videos, Synology's kind of utilization of USB has been a bit spotty. When they moved over from DSM 6.2 into DSM 7, they removed a lot of compatible USB devices for reasons of security from their array, list of supported USB devices. Now, some of us would have liked to have used network dongles, maybe add 2.5 or 5G, you know. And maybe you would have liked to have used, you know, TV and, you know, DVT antennas there, digital TV antennas. Not really something for this system, but the principle's still there. Also, these are USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports. So again, 5 gigabits per second, like other Synology devices, when most brands out there are rolling out USB 3.2 Gen 2. Now, some of that might be a limitation of the CPU and the range of things it can support in its chipset and lanes, but Synology seems to be quite, you know, stuck on remaining at USB 3.2 Gen 1 there. And if you're utilizing storage drives that are, you know, standard external hard drives or USB 3.2 Gen 1, you're not going to mind. But the minute you start using these days very affordable SSDs, such as M2 external SSDs that can crank out, you know, 10 gigabits per second here very easily, and it's going to slow down your backups. You can use them for UPSs, you can assign them to VMs and like, I believe, containers. I'll have to double check that. But overall, the USB support with those two there, and of course the front mounted one here on the bottom, although no one-touch copy button, no. Overall, I'm not overly bowled over by much in terms of network connectivity on this, apart from that 10G and the PCIe. The PCIes, by the way, also are largely only Synology supported cards as well, which again, much like the hard drives, may rub some people up the wrong way. Again, I'm not going to rag on this system for not having 2.5 GBE like I have in other videos for other systems, because it includes the 10G and this XS system. A lot of that contingent of users were never going to touch 2.5. They would have gone 1 straight to 10. So they're, you know, inclusive of the 10 for me is absolutely fine. And lastly, you've got an out of bounds port there that allows you to sort of go around into accessing the device for troubleshooting outside of the usual network means, and DSM supported there on the back. But the ports and connections aside, I think we need to talk about not only the, you know, the traffic flow that this thing's capable of, but how it intends to do it. And for that, let's talk a little bit about the CPU and memory inside. So the CPU and memory of this device is actually, for the most part, something I'm okay with. I actually quite like what we've got. I've got a few little nitpicks, you know, Mr. Nibbly Pibbly that I am, but for the most part, I'm okay with it. It's just where it sits in the grander portfolio where I have something more of an issue, but I'll get to that in a second. Now, the CPU inside, Synology have gone with another embedded AMD Ryzen inside this system. So it is the AMD embedded Ryzen V1780B, a CPU that last year we kind of, myself and Eddie, kind of spec'd on a few videos that we knew that would be the next jump from Synology in some of their ranges, keyword some. Now, compare that against the other 8-bay, the 1821, that arrives with the V1500B processor there. And again, that was a quad-core 2.2 gigahertz processor there, 4-core, 8-thread like this, 4-core, 8-thread. You know, not too bad in terms of that one, but this being more than a gigahertz per core better, still maintaining the quad-core 8-thread build there at 3.35 gigahertz per core that can be burst up to 3.6. That's some good hardware to have under the belt. Yes, it's going to be a bit more power hungry, but you're already looking at an 8-bay with 10 GBE on board, so you must have known somewhere along the line that the TDP of that CPU and your general power use was going to be a little higher. Now, Where things for me with that CPU get a little bit more complex is that the 6-bay before this, which again we've never really had confirmation, at least at the moment, maybe in the future it'll pan out with the portfolio, whether this is an upgrade to that 6-bay, the 1621xs Plus. The reason is that that arrives with a quad-core Xeon processor there. And yes, it's a lower clock speed, but that was a Xeon processor, which I know a number of you heavily associate the XS series with. And it's only been within the last 18 months to 2 years that we've seen a lot of these end-level devices, such as the SA series, make the switch from Intel processors and with Xeon over to AMD with the EPYC processors there. So although we largely suspected they'd go AMD with this processor, and it is a good processor with some good performance stats behind it, there are going to be a contingent of users that are going to miss the fact that it could have had a Xeon on board, much like every other 10G XS that has come before it, desktop or rack mount otherwise. Another thing to bear in mind with that processor, and this is actually quite recent, because I'm not going to rag on that processor, I'm not. Although it doesn't have integrated graphics, this isn't a system that Synology have placed in their kind of home multimedia type devices. This is an enterprise level box, which again, in that field, normally it would have been a Xeon by now. My big complaint probably is a bit strong, my difficulty with this CPU as far as the last few weeks are concerned, was the launch of the RS2423 Plus rack mount. Now that is a 12-bay rack mount that was announced recently. I believe it launched on the 1st of March. What we heard about it here on NAS Compares about a week or so before. And that rack mount is in the Plus series. So it's a rack mount in the Plus series. And its predecessor had that V1500B processor one. But that 12-bay rack mount has got 10 GBE, and it has the same CPU as this. And that system, again, knocks around in the $2,000 or so mark. And it's in the Plus series. I think it's probably about 2,400 really. But it's got the same CPU as this, which is really odd for me when you look at that 3622 I mentioned earlier on, the 12-bay XS series. That's got two 10G ports. It's got a 6-core Xeon processor and twice the memory of this system. Yes, it costs $1,000 more, give or take, but you are getting a substantially more powerful box with even more storage potential, both on the base level and expandable level. And that's where this CPU kind of gets my goat a bit. I kind of understand why it's only one 10G port when you think about saturation on the base level. But for that price point and this CPU, and that CPU starting to appear on Plus series devices, it's a weird choice of processor when I do believe a Xeon would have made more sense within the history of the portfolio of Synology devices. And in featuring that processor on this, and then going ahead and using that processor within the same 23-year series on a Plus series, it just doesn't compute to me. Again, you'd have to be very deep into Synology to see why that crossover seems odd. But for most people, when it comes to that CPU, it can get mostly everything done. Maybe some higher end graphical manipulated stuff. And again, when it comes to server side transcodes and conversions, if you're, of HEVC or really dense media where you need the server to do the job, you might hit a wall. And maybe with more graphical virtual machines, you might hit a wall. But in every other regard, when it comes to surveillance, supporting up to 75 cameras, and this thing running like a dream in surveillance for us, with the 2 camera licenses that are included, silly. With the VMs that we ran, and later on in the video, you'll see me with this with a couple of VMs. When we get this back and plugged in, we've got a Linux VM and a Windows VM. Ran like a dream. We had a couple of cameras running at the same time. We were running backups. We were doing everything, and still didn't max out its hardware. Lovely stuff there. And in terms of memory, it arrives with 8 gig of ECC DDR4 memory there. So again, ECC error correcting code or error code correction, depending on where you want to sit on the fence on that one. That means all the data passing into it, the memory has an extra chip on board where as the data passes through, it creates, let's just call it a blueprint to keep it nice and chewable. It creates a blueprint of the data passing through that memory, and then at the other end it compares the data that's been passed through. Any inconsistencies, it repairs it, and that's great for long-term data storage, your cold storage, your archival storage. Well, what you don't want is a little inconsistency in a database, a little inconsistency in some archived data you might want to unzip that becomes a problem later on. Again, the 8 gig, much like the other 8-bay systems of late, and the 6-bay systems can be upgraded to 32 gig, but you do have to use Synology's own memory, much like those hard drives and the NVMe's and the PCIe slots. If you don't use Synology memory, the system will highlight this to you. And yes, we will be doing third-party memory testing very, very soon, so stay tuned for that. But overall, with the CPU and the memory architecture of this, I can't really fault it. It's definitely going to push through that 1000 megs, and it's definitely going to run DSM-7 remarkably well. But for those of you new to Synology's platform or have been recommended this device, what is DSM-7? What can it do? Let's make our way over to the desktop, get this plugged in, and I'm going to walk you through DSM-7 on this device. Okay, so here we are on the desktop of the DS1823xs Plus. And before we go further, a few little bits and bobs about this review of the software so we can get things into the right context. First and foremost, you may notice at the bottom that RAM utilization is pretty darn high. The reason for that is because I'm running a lot of applications at once. I'm running a whole bunch of apps that you normally won't be using all of these. And of course, at the same time, I am running a couple of virtual machines that I'm going to talk about later on in the video. Consequently, I've had to assign memory 2 gig to each of those VMs, as well as a couple of virtual cores each. Consequently, the average CPU and memory utilization in this is not going to be representative of what it's going to be like for you. So don't worry too much when you see that memory and CPU utilization spike up a bit. The next thing I'll talk about is I'm not going to be doing any 10G testing in this. Reason being, right now I was expanding an existing subset of drives, and when I was talking about a few days ago the reveal of Synology's new HDD drives, part of that video was me talking to you guys about the firmware. If you watched that video, great. Otherwise, there's going to be a quick update on that in about a few minutes in this video. But when I was introducing new drives into this configuration here, it is meaning that the pool expansion that I added to there is taking a great deal of time. And if I try to do 10G performance testing whilst these drives are still being optimized within that RAID and the RAID configuration is being improved upon, the result is going to be lower performance benchmarks. So I could have delayed this video 3, 4, maybe even 5 days. But rather than do that, I thought I'd get the full review out here, and much like my other videos, introduce the 10G testing in its own separate video, which should come in just a few days alongside the 5x5, a dedicated VM video and a dedicated surveillance video for this system here. So again, that's why we're not including 10G testing and why the CPU and memory utilization is quite high. But straight away, you can run everything in Synology's lineup of applications. As I alluded to there on screen, there are all manner of applications I've installed here. And in this video, we're going to go through kind of 4 main subsets. We're going to be going through system applications, ones that are pretty much there from the beginning. These are, come under the heading of services and more. Then we're going to look at kind of file sharing, kind of storage integration application. Then we're going to look at backup, synchronization tools, multimedia as well. And then at the end, we'll look at some of the specialized ones. Again, surveillance and VMs on this. Very, very good there. We could talk about some of the cloud-based ones, the ones that are integrated with C2 quite extensively. But we're not going to do that in this video because we're waiting until DSM 7.2, the beta or full rollout, before we really sink our teeth into those. Otherwise, we're kind of going to have to attack the subject twice in a short space of time, and you guys hate repetition. So, you may have noticed already there on screen a lot of red blocks here on the bottom. Now, none of these are dead drives. Now, I was originally thinking of not including this bit, but I think it's really, really important because of the way Synology and its XS series is presented, that we sort of talk a little bit about this right here at the beginning. Because if we go to the list of drives, you've got some red there. So first, let's tackle the green. The green here at the top there is our drives that we've got installed. That's Synology's HDD entry-level drives there, 16 TB. We've got a couple of them in there. And if we go to the bottom, you can see a couple of greens there. These are the M2 NVMe's, which I'm pleased to say can be utilized as both storage and as caching. So you've got the option of both of these being utilized for whatever purpose you need, and particularly in a 10G box, that's going to be great news to hear. I do want to add though that me and Eddie were doing some digging around in the background, and when we installed these drives, obviously we thought, you know what, we'll patch in with putty, and much like we saw in previous generation devices of the 923 and the 723, this device, although it does have those 4x4 slots, they have been bottled down to 3x1, presumably once again for heating and degradation and throttling reasons there, but I know a lot of you are going to be less keen on the idea these drives have been capped down to 3x1 there. As you can see, not terrible, but it is still a throttling of those M2 NVMe's that some of you might not like. Still get 1000 megs each, but again, a little disappointing to hear. Going back to that colour palette there though, why are some of these drives red? Well, these drives, despite being these two here, Synology drives, are listed as unverified. Why is that? And that is because these drives have got that option of Synology drives to allow you to update the firmware. And if you don't update the firmware on Synology drives, the system will state that you need to update them to get them verified. Otherwise, you're using them in a non-supported way. Now, again, the ability to update the firmware, fantastic stuff. This is not a review of Synology hard drives. This is of the XS system. But given the XS system is a lot more slanted towards Synology supporting their own drives, it is worth highlighting that if you have drives that have firmware updates inside, you will need to update that firmware if you want to introduce them to an existing RAID array. Again, not the end of the world, but you will need to reboot the system. So if you have active shares in place, like I have right now, and alongside those active shares, you may well be running a RAID rebuild. You've introduced a new drive into an existing RAID. Perhaps one of your drives died. You're in degraded mode. You're introducing a new drive to rebuild the RAID. Bear in mind that the drive you're going to introduce, if it doesn't have the latest firmware, the Synology system will still classify it as unverified. So if you're watching this Synology, maybe label these drives that need a firmware update something slightly different than unverified, because in a pinch, if you're looking at RAID degradation and a rebuild, that might be slightly unsettling that you're introducing a drive into that RAID group that is being listed by the system as unverified there. It's a very small thing, but when you really get zoomed in and you see that I've got a couple of Seagate drives in here, I've got an 18 TB and a 20 TB. The reason being I was bench testing the 18 TB Mac 2 series from Seagate there, and the Exos 2X18 alongside a 20 TB drive. I'll tell you right now that both of these drives are still listed as unverified. I can introduce them into a RAID array. It won't stop me. So for example, if I want to go ahead, take both of these drives, manage the available drives, create a new storage pool, I can go ahead, click next, select the RAID group. So we're going to go with a standard RAID 0, sort of combine them up. Bit wasteful, but never mind. We can go ahead and we can introduce those drives. It would just warn us in a page or so's time that we are using unverified drives there. So again, although they're not on the compatibility list, we can utilize them, but again, then we're living outside of that Synology support remit there to a degree. And although they will support you as much as they can, you are still using the system outside of the way that they have stated the system can be used. Now, continuing on that subject of storage, we already talked about the fact that there is the lack of Synology Hybrid RAID on the XS series. You still have BTRFS, and indeed when you make your way into that storage area, you do have access to the bulk of the settings there for like fast RAID rebuild, configuring the RAID resync, all of those options there, and auto repair if you're going to be utilizing a hot swap drive. And this is an 8-bay, so you might an 8-bay is when you should really start thinking about your RAID 6, your double parity, that sort of thing, and hot spares, and having that auto click straight in is quite handy there. Moving away from just standard storage, your pools and your volumes on top, we can talk about interacting with that storage. Again, searching the system, very, very easy. You can use the search tool there at the top. You can run a tool there. And if you do that, it will search the system for application services and settings. Again, bear in mind, we are using a lot of memory right here. And again, that extends to if you want to use the universal search tool, which is a little bit deeper, built on the same logic there, but a dedicated tool. So you can go ahead and again, search for files, formats, more, and it will go through and find all of this stuff nice and easily for you. It's got the inbuilt file manager there, breadcrumb based, copy, paste, extract, encrypt, create shared folders, archive, zipping, that sort of thing. It's all built in. And again, when you bolt on your Synology C2 with things like hybrid share, they will appear there as well. Again, lots of the configuration options you might suspect. If you want to go into like photos, for example, you can go ahead and view all of your photos in this window, and you have a kind of a limited amount of things you can do and access while you're doing it via the web browser. Again, I apologise for the slight delay there. The system is quite busy for memory. But again, you can view them in there. You've got access to a lot of the information there. Some of that metadata is indeed accessible there while you're going through the system. And again, you can go that, but obviously they would prefer you to use some of the dedicated tools that I'll talk about later on, such as Synology Photos or, you know, multimedia streaming. The file station application there is very, very good. Obviously, a lot of users are going to jump straight into something like Synology Drive. Synology Drive is their own premium synchronization multi-platform tool. So not only does it allow you to access your NAS via the web browser in a, you know, single portal access way that you might use like a Dropbox or a Google Drive, with also support of Synology's Office application as well, I might add. So that's their alternative to things like Google Docs and, you know, Microsoft Office 365. And with the Office tool, it allows you to open up things natively. What do I mean by that? Well, when you go in, for example, we have got a bunch of different kinds of files here. So we have got a PDF, so we can double click a PDF, and it allows us to open this PDF document inside the web browser using Synology's own tool. This is from a presentation from the brand's download file there. Again, we can go for a spreadsheet. So this is a spreadsheet that I was using when testing power utilization on different NASs. And again, we click that button, opens up in a new tab. Then we can access this file via Synology's own Office application, much like you would with your first-party tools there. We'll just leave that in there to migrate there in the background. The network's rather busy right now, can you tell? So don't blame this too much for how slow it's being there. I am kind of really hammering the system here in the background a little bit. At the same time, you can go back in there, close that dock. You've got support of things like PPTX. So PPTX files there, that is going to be kind of like your presentations there. This is an old one from Synology, and again, that's for a lot of people that are doing a kind of click, look at these slides kind of gig. And as same goes, you can open up Word docs, again, much like the same thing, open it up in Synology Office, boom, you can edit these files, you can go through them, you can import them or use their original file format. There is an update in Synology Office coming very, very soon that allows you to take better utilization and support of third-party supported format and things like Microsoft Word. And again, there's a lot of support there. And if you don't want to access these folders this way, there are supported client applications for iOS, for Android, for Windows clients, for Mac clients and Linux as well. And these clients allow you, once you set up and synchronize your local machine, so this window you're looking at here is on my local PC, this allows you to establish a link between your local machine and that NAS. So you can create team folders for all your individual groups, where they're going to be using it for standard work, backing up, synchronizing important documents on a multi-site setup, even editing to a degree depending on your network speed. And this can be established via the local area network or remotely using Synology's Quick Connect system. So as you can see, I have already added this NAS here, and there is the share, that folder that we're looking at there, new share 2. If we go into my own settings there, we make our way into the PC. As you can see on the left hand side of the screen, we've got now a dedicated folder, new share 2. So I've created a home folder, and there is all of those documents there. So, and again, it also supports file pinning, file streaming, live metadata harness. So, for example, let's look at these files here. We've got these four, we'll go for these ones down here. There's that session data from earlier, the one that we looked at on the screen. Now, locally, we can right-click. I know a lot of you have seen this before, but again, this is for people that have not utilized this system. As you can see, the file is just 3 meg in size, but it's taking 0 room up on my local PC. So, if I want to access it, I would right click it, open it up in my web browser of choice. So again, open up in a brand new tab, whatever, or I can right click and then get a context menu. And in this context menu, I can choose whether I want to get a link that I can share with other people. Again, I don't need to locally download the file. Alternatively, with the context file there, I can choose to pin a local copy. So from this moment forward, this file will always be available and synchronized on my local system. Or once I've accessed it once, like with these files here, once you've accessed the file once, like a picture of a bar there, because apparently I've got a problem, it then goes to a slightly different green tick here, where it is the white background green tick. And this means that file is kept for a certain period of time on my local system, and then eventually over time, it will be the cache will flush that and free up that space if I need to. But I can, if I choose, go ahead, go into the context menu, and I can go ahead and free up space and then force the system to empty it. And as you'll see, it goes back to the cloud there. So again, that's something you can do across multiple devices, all sharing that teamed folder. And if you've got a big team of users, you're going to be able to utilize that application. And again, you can add multiple files and folders from your existing connected NASs if you choose to. So we can go ahead, go into the NAS there. We can go into the folders. So if I choose to, I could create a new shell with a new folder, select where I want it to pin on my local machine. So I can go ahead, let's go with something bog standard. We'll just go straight to, let's go for users, go into there, Robbie there. And we'll just stick that on the desktop. And again, if we choose to, we can create its own standalone Synology Drive folder, or you can, if you choose to, delete that local folder so it just goes directly into the parent directory if you choose. Very easy to set up, and again, you can set up file filters, parameters, things where you want to make sure not everything is synced, like certain file formats aren't synchronized, certain file sizes aren't synchronized, dates, synchronization modes, versioning, all that stuff is kept as well. So again, it's a very, very great tool. So moving away from that, while we sort of go back to these files and folders here, back into the subject of storage, we've got the ability to create a nice little LUNs. So these are logical unit number storage connected to that live within the NAS, separate from your normal storage. You've got access to things like snapshot retention and kind of off-site snapshot archiving as well, which you can apply to different storage types. But if you want to have a parallel storage area where you've got your breadcrumb file folder storage there in FileStation, but what you also want is kind of large bucket blob type circular storage that you bolt in to be used separately for very enterprise-esque provisions, that's something you can do. I've talked about it here on the channel before, but for example, if we make our way, let's come out of that, go into the PC, what you can do is also connect the NAS in another way. So on the left-hand side, we still have our connection to Synology Drive there. We've also got a mapped network drive, which is when I've created a shared folder on the NAS, which is now accessible remotely. But alternatively, what I could have done is utilize a SAN and create some storage that has the appearance of local storage on my system. This allows me, if I'm doing photo video editing over 10 GBE, running a large-scale database, running applications that need an uncluttered, uncomplicated means of accessing the NAS without the local software or client going, this isn't local storage. You can use that methodology, and there's loads of other advantages to iSCSI storage that aren't just limited to enterprise there. Coming out of that, you've got things like the storage analyzer, where you can generate reports periodically, and these reports will allow you to kind of analyze what your system has accrued in terms of data growth over time. And again, a lot of this will be based on how you've used the system and also the policies that the settings that you put to your report generation. This is a free extra that's included in the system to generate those periodically. You can have those emailed to you or just generated local to the system. And of course, if you want far deeper information, you would use something like the CMS system here at the bottom, or better yet, there at the top. I'm not sure how well you can see it with my face in the way. Things like Active Insight to monitor the system quite a lot. There's also a new cloud monitoring tool in DSM 7.2 that we'll be talking about very, very soon. On top of that, we've already talked about snapshot replication, which you can pretty much assign to most of the applications within the system, as well as snapshot replication to make sure those snapshots aren't just kept within system, but bear in mind they're just kind of blueprints. Overall, with time managed, if you lose one, they're useless. But so bear that in mind. That is not the same as a backup. It's more of a restoration policy. You've got the resource monitor there, already built in. We've talked about that for extensively. And it is a useful tool there, but I think we should move on to something a little bit more interesting, do you think? So over to the multimedia users, because there are going to be people that are looking at this 8-bay with a little bit of extra oomph inside for their multimedia server and just generally sharing their collection of, photo, video, music they've accrued for the last few decades. And I'd say overall, although that CPU is a little bit limiting in some regards when it comes to graphical manipulation, for the most part, it's okay. But for those of you that are thinking about this for things like a Plex Media server, there are a couple of limitations that I'll touch on later on. But going on with the Synology apps, obviously you've got things like the multimedia server that you can create a DLNA or universal plug and play, localized access media server for your smart home devices that are just going to pick it up locally on the network, and even your relatively dumb ones. On top of that, you've got obviously support the indexing services there built in that allow you to just sort of point the system where your data lives. Although I will highlight applications like Synology Drive, as we touched on in a recent video that I'd largely forgotten for that matter. Synology still seems a little bit stodgy on some of its applications, needing all of the data such as photo collections in the Photos application that we'll talk about being in a very specific place, but more on that later on. When it comes to music, you've got things like Audio Station and a bunch of applications for different client tools that allow you to stream your music all around your home and remotely. They're also one of the few brands that have an application for their NAS server available on things like Amazon Alexa. They've even got multimedia apps on the Google Smart Home platform as well. So if you do own like an Amazon voice recognition device that's sitting there in the corner, you just go, Alexa, play my music. You can run via the Synology app to play the music out of your smart speaker from the NAS then. The same goes with support of things like Sonos and both systems and stuff like that. On top of that, if we move forward, we've then got Synology's photo application. Again, largely good, although it has removed a couple of features that were in Synology Moment and Synology Photo Station. There is still the facial recognition there, and again, we've done loads of videos on this with the AI photo recognition, where it analyzes your database, asks you to label everyone together. So for example, this is me. You would go ahead, give that person a name, and then you can start merging some of these very, very easily. Give everyone a name, nice and simple. It will say if you want to see them together. It's very straightforward, and then after that you can use search functionality if some of those people are in the same photo to kind of easily catalog your database there. The same goes if you want to utilize it for scraping the metadata, or not scraping it, but accessing the metadata of your photos for geolocational data, although things like thing recognition with the AI, outside food, architecture, stuff like that isn't supported still. You have got access to a lot of quick filters there. You've also got the option to switch to folder views, but again, the folder view isn't a breadcrumb folder view like you would have in File Station. This folder view is really just still within the Photo Station application there. Again, not Photo Station, Synology Photos application. We've done loads of videos on this tool. It is a great tool. It's had some features and services removed or changed since the two separate applications in DSM 6.2, which a lot of users are still waiting on coming back there. But it is still a great tool. You do have that option as well of flicking the viewpoint between either you, the private user, or switching to that mode where you're creating shares that you would use professionally, where you go, no, I want these to be accessed by me, and I'm creating all these subset albums that can be shared publicly or with very preset ways and means for these photos to be shared. So for example, picture of a Christmas tree here. If there is any metadata, it can be scraped there out of the background. Unfortunately, this isn't one of those. From there, with the sharing of this file, you can go ahead and choose how you want the file shared, length of time you want it shared for, do you want it password protected, do you only want it to be accessed by preset people, stuff like that. And again, lots of information there to play with for you to get along with in the application. Even though it's smart album filter creation that we talked about, allowing you to catalog, go through, say if you've added people, I only want the photos of this person, narrow it down. So first and foremost, I want all the pictures of Robbie. I only want pictures of Robbie taken in 2020. I want these files and photos to be in certain geolocational places if I've assigned them, and there you go. You can use that to catalog all of those, and then after that you can choose whether you want to add those into their own specific album and create a smart filter album, or just go ahead and catalog them together and then choose that you want to share all of those images either one by one or the whole thing as a whole. Create an album, share, download, however you see fit. So it's a great little application there. I just wish there was a few features that the previous generation of apps had. The other thing to talk about is Video Station. This is their alternative to compete with things like Plex Media Server and stuff like that, that allow not only you to access your database of movies in that lovely visual appealing way, again, client apps for mobile, for desktop, for Fire TV, etc, etc. On top of that, the scraping of metadata there allows you to get all the casting information, reviews, all that stuff that you would love to see. Again, much like Plex does, but although it's worth highlighting after you've added your albums, if you do want to scrape metadata, unlike Plex and Jellyfin, where you just go, scrape the metadata for me, the Synology will require you to add an API key. It is completely for free, but heading over to the movie database and TV database there to get that API key, you have to register on their site to get that. It's free, it just takes a bit more time, but it allows you to scrape all that metadata there for all of your TV shows effectively. Now, we mentioned earlier on about Plex. It's worth highlighting. I've already set up Plex and Jellyfin. I will be doing Plex and Jellyfin testing on this NAS, maybe MB as well. I haven't decided yet. And from there, we can see that we can access everything pretty much largely the same. You've got the scraping of that metadata built in. So again, we use exactly the same file. Same goes if we go into Plex Media Server on this NAS. Both of these access locally. It's got all that scraped metadata. Once again, don't worry about these slight delays. We are doing quite a lot in the background on this system. There's going to be that ever so slight lag. You're not going to have that because you're not going to do all these things like I'm doing it. And again, you've got all that scraping of metadata, exactly what you'd expect from Jellyfin and Plex. I will highlight though, that again, because of this CPU lacking integrated graphics, it is going to work that bit hard when it comes to having to do transcoding, so reshaping of files. Again, dedicated video on this coming soon, but case in point, if we go into our 4K files there, and we try to play a file, so for example, this is an HEVC file here. It is known as the roast duck file here, and then HEVC is a highly efficient video codec, requires a license, which the Synology doesn't include, and although you can get a license for the system in the advanced media extension add-on here, this is just for Synology internal use, so you're not really going to see the benefits. But within Plex Media Server there, you can go ahead, for example, play this file here, quite a dense little file, and what you'll see here on screen is it's going to have to work quite hard to play this file. It will need to convert the file automatically, but that's because I'm running this on a system that doesn't have that license in the web browser. Then you might be using a device like a phone that you want to convert the file, or you're using like a PS5, a PS4 streaming this file, which doesn't have client-side transcoding or encoding and doesn't have an HEVC license natively, and you have to get it separately. So as you can see, it's taking a while to play back that file, and CPU utilization is going to grow if the file plays at all. But just to give you a bit of context there, if you were to use the Plex Media Server client application like this one for Windows, and we go to the exact same files there, we find the roast duck file. As soon as it loads up there, the system is probably just recovering from the battering I just gave it trying to play back that file with the lack of transcoding there. If we go back into the system there, bring that back, go back into that app, we go back into the list of files. What we want is roast duck, bring it up there. Because my local system has support of HEVC, if I play back this file, bring that up there on the web browser, maybe bring it down a little bit, the file will play immediately, and it will play in its original format there. So again, as long as you're not going to be overly reliant on that kind of workload of transcoding files, and you're not going to need conversions on the server side, this NAS is going to do very, very well indeed. But we are seeing quite high CPU utilization. But again, we are doing a lot on this system, so it's not really a fair comparison of that system. But again, more of that on the dedicated video. But for now, let's move on to some of those specialized applications and end the software portion of this video. Now, when it comes to the specialized applications that this system has, again, we could probably double the length of this video trying to go through all of them. We've not really talked enough about the backup applications. We've got things like Active Backup Suite, which again is that fantastic multi-platform. Again, this is a whole video in itself. It's almost worth the price of admission. On a lot of Synology applications, it's a premium tool there that not only allows you to back up Synology NASs, whole configuration file format, everything to the last detail to another NAS, but also local servers, local Mac and Windows systems, all of that. Think of Time Machine, but on a larger scale. On top of that, you've got synchronization and backups locally and outside of the system with the tool Hyper Backup there. So again, while my eyes aren't working there, while I'm scanning all the applications trying to find Hyper because my eyes don't work, with Hyper Backup there, it allows you to synchronize backups with remote NASs over things like RTRR, rsync, that sort of thing in either direction. Support of cloud backups as well, once again in either direction, USB backups, local file-to-file backups, and more. Then you've got things like USB backup, which again, much like the same thing, very straightforward there, if my eyes will work, where again you can connect a local USB drive and either have it actioning in either direction onto there with multiple USB drives supported. Again, USB support on Synology's been a bit meh, but for the most part, when it comes to backups, you've got a lot of options, as well as assigning those USB ports to VMs. More on those in just a moment. So, although I've kind of skimmed over Synology Active Backup there, Active Backup is just this enormous behemoth tool that allows you to back up and synchronize, to many regards, existing cloud, third-party cloud like Office 365, like Google Workspace with your system, which if you're utilizing in your home office environment, to do your emails, your accounts, all of your kind of business data and account creation off a multi-site, you can then synchronize it with this bare metal on-premises hardware. If you lose remote access to those cloud services, you can still synchronize with the NAS with all of your data natively, and when an internet connection is re-established, it in the background will re-synchronize the data you've created in the interim. Moving away from that, you've got things like Synology Chat. Synology Chat, which is an alternative to things like WhatsApp, which is an alternative to things like Skype, that allows all of your connected users to have their own client tool. Again, iOS, Android, Windows, Mac OS, that sort of thing. And that tool locally allows everyone to be able to communicate, and all of the communication logs, again, with sharing files locally, sharing information, pin boards of shared files and more. And just things like emojis and GIFs and stuff like that, all supported within the chat. So you've got an in-network encrypted and protected communication system with you and your employees, as well as support of mail applications. So if you want to run your mail servers, either porting over and synchronizing your third-party email host or running an independent one from the Synology, all of that is possible. And Synology Chat, I feel, doesn't get enough respect, and it's the only NAS brand that I know of outside of top-tier kind of unified storage providers that give you this in-house communication tool that's first-party there. Then, as we mentioned earlier on, virtual machines, they come in sort of two forms. You've got things like support of Docker, which allow you to create little containers, access to the registry there, which will allow you to create these kind of sandboxy held applications and tools that you can test out and run without running on a full-fledged OS hypervisor. On top of that, you of course have got Synology's own virtual machine tool, which again is there. And the virtual machine tool there not only allows you to run virtual versions of DSM if you choose, but on top of that, you can port over existing VMs. You can convert existing VMs. And again, this can also be used if you're utilizing things like VMware or Hyper-V. In some cases, if you are synchronizing that VM that's running on those third-party platforms, you can synchronize it with the Synology, and if you lose connection, you can then host it on the Synology, which is really, really impressive. And once you introduce things like Synology High Availability as well, you've got a real fail-safe platform there. Yeah, you've got to double up on your spending in an HA, but having that option is still pretty darn cool. And the virtual machine support is pretty broad too. And the ability to kind of take snapshots of these things and create rollback provisions is pretty cool. Again, you can run these, shut them down, action them. And again, I'm running two of them here in the web browser. It's not the ideal way to run a VM, let's be honest. The response is going to be a little flaky. I would personally recommend utilizing things like a remote desktop connection or one of the many VNC type tools. But again, the VMs run absolutely fine here, and you can assign quite a lot of CPU cores because this is a quad-core CPU. You think, oh, I've only got 4 cores. You've got 8 threads, so you've got 8 virtual CPUs to play with. It gave me the ability to give each of these VMs 2 gig memory, 2 CPU cores to run on those virtual threads, and therefore allow more VMs to be utilized. You don't have to use it all, but it's nice to have that extended ability to host a lot of VMs or create them on the fly. And again, there is a large range of support there built in within the VM tool. Finally, you got Surveillance Station, another worth the price of admission tool for a lot of users, which although it's by no means perfect, it's pretty darn close in terms of application for surveillance on any NAS platform there. To zoom in a little bit, we zoomed out and kind of lost that background bit there. We've already added a couple of cameras. You've got 2 camera licenses included. I know there are mixed feelings on camera licenses. More on that in a video in a couple of weeks. When you go to the monitoring center to have a look at it here, again, we do have a busy network system here happening there in the background. I apologize for the delays. But we've got a couple of cameras running into the system here. We got this one here. I'm just going to wave up there at the top left. And again, you can create all manner of different things here. So, for example, you can choose to kind of control the pan tilt zoom of some of these from within the feed. There is a client tool for Windows. There is mobile applications too. You've also got a range of applications and services you can add on. Everything from making an individual camera live with a YouTube link in there, which is pretty insane. You've also got integration tools such as edge recording if you're running an SD card inside. You've then got things like C2 storage integration there with Synology Surveillance, which allows you to have recordings going to the NAS, but also to the cloud if you're running Synology C2, to have that failsafe if someone breaks in, smashes the camera, burns the place down, that kind of stuff where your NAS was in-house. And again, although AI supported services are not available on this, unlike on a DVA system, people counted license recognition, vehicle recognition, thing recognition, with Synology's cameras coming soon, we're kind of hoping that the NAS will be able to harness a lot of those hardware attributes of the camera and then have access to these features in Surveillance Station 9. You already have things like privacy masks, blurring, watermark, stuff like that, all built into this, and a huge control deck available to you. But again, we're going to do a DVA 1622 and cameras video soon to show that off a little bit more extensively. But what I will say to a lot of you is that if you are running cameras from things like Reolink, Hikvision, even Axis at the top end, you can use a lot of your cameras kind of notifications and settings and push those to the NAS. It's not perfect, and the level of things you can adapt on the cameras on the Synology are pretty darn extensive, so we can edit a lot of the settings there, kind of the profiles, stream profiles, areas of effect, event detection, whether it's going to be from the camera or do you want to use Surveillance Station's own hardware services to do it. You can tailor a lot of stuff there. And I know a lot of you aren't going to be as keen on just 2 camera licenses, but there's still quite a lot for all of the features you're getting packed in. Maybe it should have come with at least 4, given it's an excess level system. But again, I still feel like the licensing system by not just Synology, but by every NAS brand could be better. I understand there has to be funding, but I do think the way it's approached currently is not exactly ideal. But let's go back into the studio now and summarize today's review. This has been a long software portion, and ultimately, this is quite a versatile NAS there. That CPU is not going to be for everyone, but then the XS series is always going to be more about file throughput than anything else. And lastly, again, we will be revisiting, as mentioned in the intro, the subject of 10GBE and some of that performance later on when the RAID group is completed, but that's for a future video. Let's head over to the conclusion. So what do I think? Well, I quite like this device. I will say it's a wee bit more expensive than it should be, but we'll get on that more in the con side of things. But if we stick with positive just to start with, first and foremost, obviously, DSM-7, absolute dream. And it's from a lot of users, whether it is individual applications like Synology Drive, Active Backup, Surveillance Station, and Virtual Machine Manager, whether you're buying it specifically for one of those apps or for the multitude of those apps, all contained in the package along with the backup applications and more, DSM runs like a dream on this. You're going to be able to have access to absolutely the whole of Synology's lineup of applications, as well as those third-party ones as well. And with DSM 7.2 rolling out in beta exceptionally soon, no doubt there is also the fact that with support of things like read once, write many, with worm support there, and full volume encryption on this device, it's only going to make it more appealing to the enterprise crowd, along with increases on the scale of storage as well, in terms of that overall storage pool and volume sizes. On top of that, within those applications as well, we've got to talk about the storage. 8 bays of storage on this, with support of up to 18 TB Synology hard drives, and let's just say support of third-party drives to a point, in a way, unofficially. There's a lot to play with here storage-wise. You've got all of those bays at the front, you've got the 2 M2 NVMe slots inside, and then you've got the option of adding 2 expansion bays there. So there's a huge amount of long-term storage to play with the memory inside that's handling all that data passing through being ECC, to make sure that data is checked rigorously before your cold storage level. But those different storage areas means you're going to be able to create that tiered storage. With your, if you're an editor, for example, more on that in a sec, you can utilize the M2 NVMe's as your editing area and then synchronize it with either a whole archival storage or separate storage areas to create that hot, warm, cold storage architecture within the system. Just make sure you've got another off-site backup. That CPU, again, apropos of all the business of CPU placement on other systems like the Xeon on the 6 bay and that 12 bay being quite beefy, the CPU in of itself is very, very good, not only because of its high clock speed to get stuff done, although there will be a high power consumption. It being a 4-core 8-thread means lots of virtual CPUs that you can attach to other processes in a far more incremental fashion than standard cores would do, and you can do that manually. There is a lack of embedded graphics on that processor, but I would have been very surprised if this system had arrived with integrated graphics, frankly, so I'm not going to judge it too harshly on that one. Also, the chassis design, I talk about it all the time. This is by far one of my favourite Synology chassis in terms of the scale of what it is containing, heat dissipation, ventilation, noise level. It's not a quiet chassis by any regard, but it's by no means the noisiest either. And for an 8 bay to have this much ventilation and cooling and still have the power consumption and the heat dissipation and lower noise than you would expect than other 8 bay systems in the market right now, that is always going to impress me, and I've always liked that chassis. And lastly, if you are watching this because you were making that move away from Drobo and you heard about this device, or just generally, you are a content creator, working in post-production, working in broadcast, a photo video editor in general, this is a solid little choice, not only because of its scalability, although the lack of Synology hybrid RAID is a bit of a bummer. It is still a great system for photo video editors that are looking to jump into the Synology platform, that looked at things like the DS923 that has an optional 10G but has a dual-core processor and need some serious hardware for long-term 1080p 4K editing. Maybe long down the way towards 8K, though I'm not sure this CPU would be able to handle that quite yet. But again, utilizing things like Thunderbolt 10G upgrades, allowing you on your local system to connect this to your PC or Mac and then run one cable directly into that system, boom, you've got 1000 megs editing station. It's that straightforward. And with upgrades via PCIe and also upgrades in terms of memory that you can go with there and more, it's just a great system scalably down the road for a lot of content creators and editors that want to go with the Synology platform due to the great applications that are included in DSM, but at the same time don't want to cut corners on the hardware, which sometimes on Synology they do tend to play a little safe, a little bit beige when it comes to the hardware, which this is less guilty of. But it's not all good. Some things about this are going to rub some users up the wrong way. Let's be upfront about it. That hard drive SSD compatibility stuff, that's not great. And I think although this is an XS system and it's aiming at a higher demographic who are far more into single ecosystem and complete solutions, not everyone that buys this is going to be that user, and I'm not sure about the complete absence of very obvious drives on the compatibility listing not being on there and then listing them as unverified is the right way to go about it. Also, the M2 upgrade card that we mentioned earlier on, if you want to go with a card like this one and you wanted to use M2s and it not being supported on this, the ability to add more M2s, even though Synology clearly has M2 upgrade cards for their systems, and it not working on this is a bit of a pain in the bum, because a lot of us want to use those M2s for other things, and only having 2 inside this system is one of the ways in which, although it's expandable, it is a little bit limited. And that CPU, it just confuses me that this CPU exists in this XS Series 8 bay, but it also exists on that 12 bay Plus series rack mount recently, when this system, if someone had told me about its specs, if you look at our Rumour article from late last year when we first heard about this device, we assumed it would be a Xeon. We just assumed it would be a Xeon, or at the very least with the AMD switching and EPYC processor. So it arriving with a good CPU, but also a CPU that already exists on the Plus series, sends a little bit of mixed portfolio messaging there for me. The lack of Synology Hybrid RAID as well is going to be a real pain, particularly to those of you making the jump from Drobo, who had Beyond RAID, who are kind of hearing about Synology having that fluid RAID system. And although you can migrate it over, as mentioned earlier in the video, its absence here may annoy some of you. And finally, going slightly back to that CPU, but not much. The price point on it feels like it's just a tiny bit more expensive than it should be. Not loads. I think this should be knocking around for 15 to 1600 nicker, and it knocking around at 17, 18, 1900 in some regions, depending on the tax profit margin in your eShop. It's too close in price to that 12 bay, that DS1823xs, which has got 2 10G ports, which has got a 6-core Xeon, which has got 16 gig of ECC memory, which has got 12 bays of storage, which can be expanded up to 36 drives, not 18. Having only a grand difference between, or 1000, 1100 nicker difference between this and that, does not compute, especially when that system I've just described there in all its glory came out a year ago. So that is a year-old system for a grand more, which is almost certainly now going to have some decent price points floating around. This feels just a little bit more expensive than it should be. Again, not loads, just a little bit, because you've got to factor in DSM and the base level hardware. But this has been my massive review of this, the Synology DS1823xs Plus. Yes, there'll be the short form before you buy review coming very, very soon, hopefully in the next week or so, a much shorter version of this review in bullet point form. It's just we do the big review, so it covers everything. And make sure, and of course we didn't cover 10GBE as mentioned earlier, but we will crack on with that, I promise, in another video in the next week or so. Did you enjoy this? Do you want to learn more? The full review that we're updating regularly, like all of our reviews as we do more and more testing and the weeks that we have these systems, is linked below in the description over on NAS Compares. Do check that out. And if this video has helped you to, convinced you that this might be the system for you, or that this channel in one way or another has helped you make your decision to buy your data storage system, and you were going to go at Amazon anyway, those two things better be true before you do anything else. If those two things are true, please use the links in the description to take you to Amazon, because if you use those links, it's not going to cost you anything extra. But when you get there, anything, and I mean anything you buy, results in a kickback that comes back here. It's easier than you donating or anything like that, but it also allows us to use that money to continue doing what we do. And by we, I mean me and Eddie here at NAS Compares. It's literally just us making a video and an article every single day on this subject. So do let me know if this video has helped you. Use the free advice section if you do need help. Me and Eddie manning the free advice section over on NAS Compares, the big blue button on the right. And if you need more support from the NAS community, use Ask NAS Compares, the free community forum, also linked below as well. But apart from that, have yourselves a great week, and I'll see you next time.